Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Rob Havers, President of the George C. Marshall Foundation. All right, dude.
Ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening to you all. Let's indulge ourselves one more time with a round of applause for D.C. Washington. He was magnificent. A very big thank you, too, to the United States Army Color Guard. And, of course, we are very pleased to have with us this evening the brass quintet from the Virginia Military Institute. Please be seated. It is a very great honor to welcome such a distinguished audience to celebrate the many accomplishments of two remarkable individuals and to present the 9th George C. Marshall Foundation Award to former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and the inaugural George C. Marshall Foundation Humanitarian Award to the founder of Bloomberg LP and Bloomberg Philanthropies, Michael R. Bloomberg. As we begin our evening, I invite you to enjoy your first course. I'm going to take you back while you eat to Harvard University, the 5th of June, 1947, 70 years ago on Monday. In an address that spanned astonishingly just 11 minutes, Secretary of State George C. Marshall offered an idea completely at odds with the way victorious nations had behaved in the wake of virtually every conflict. In the months following that speech, Marshall played a role in winning public and congressional support for the legislation that would create the European Recovery Program a year later in 1948. So it was that 17 European countries were rebuilt with more than 13 billion in economic and technical assistance. With that financial support came economic stability, and with that economic stability, so too did political stability follow. Economic health was crucial to the creation and the survival of free institutions, and consequently to the international peace that followed. As a result, that post-war world was remade in large part thanks to a career Army officer and a student of history with a model that stands still as the exemplar of post-conflict resolution, the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Foundation Award was established in June of 1997 by the George C. Marshall Foundation to commemorate what was the 50th anniversary of Marshall's vision. The inaugural recipient was German Chancellor Helmut Kohl. Through our museum, our research library, our archival collections, our educational and publication programs, the Marshall Foundation is the place that endeavors to keep alive the values that shaped and motivated Marshall. Our intention is to return George C. Marshall with all his myriad qualities to the forefront of popular consciousness as a paradigm of selfless service and unassailable virtues. Thanks to our many friends and supporters who have joined together this evening to recognize two great Americans. It is now my pleasure to introduce this evening's Master of Ceremonies, Walter Isaacson. Walter Isaacson is the president and the CEO of the Aspen Institute, a non-partisan educational and policy studies institute based in Washington, D.C. During a spectacular career that began in journalism, he's been chairman and CEO of CNN and the editor of Time magazine. Mr. Isaacson is also the author of several biographies: Steve Jobs in 2011, Einstein, His Life and Universe in 2007, Benjamin Franklin, An American Life in 2003, and appropriately, on this occasion, Kissinger, a biography in 1992. Born in New Orleans, Louisiana, he graduated from Harvard College and Pembroke College at Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Walter Isaacson.
Thank you, Dr. Havers, Dr. Kissinger, Mayor Bloomberg, and all of you fellow fans of the Marshall Plan, the Atlantic Alliance, NATO in all of its articles, including Article 5. Or as they call us in Washington, D.C., the resistance. It is particularly important at a time like this that we honor the ideals that General Marshall and the other wise men of that period created when they created all of those institutions. It was an astonishing burst of creativity that began with that 11-minute speech 70 years ago that helped create all of the Bretton Woods agreements, organizations, the United Nations, NATO, Radio Free Europe, so that we could win the battle for the hearts and minds of people around the world. And we recommit ourselves with this dinner every year, especially with these two honorees, Dr. Kissinger and Mayor Bloomberg, who devoted their lives, their intellects, and their work to the ideals of free men, free women, free markets, and free ideas that was at the heart of what the Marshall Plan sought to preserve. That creativity from 70 years ago is something we still rely upon today. We're still using the same institutions, whether it be IMF or NATO or the World Bank, to try to win. But in order to not only honor the people who created those institutions, we must not just preserve those institutions, but try to have another burst of creativity facing the new challenges we face in this world today, a burst of creativity that would make General Marshall proud so that we could create the new institutions for the new struggle. One of the great intellectual leaders and friends of the United States in such an endeavor has been the ambassador from Germany, Peter Wittig. Peter Wittig has been the ambassador to Washington for the past 4 years. Before that, he was ambassador to the United Nations, a distinguished career in the German Foreign Service, starting, I think, back in 1984, but also a great intellectual, professor at Freiburg for many years. So it's my pleasure to welcome on stage His Excellency Peter Wittig, the ambassador of Germany. Thank you.
Walter, thank you for that kind introduction. Dr. Kissinger, Mayor Bloomberg, President Havers, Chairman Adams, Dr. Gregorian, Ambassador Pickering, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, it's a huge pleasure for me, and above all, a tremendous honor to be here with you tonight. And what a great location you chose. Looking at the lineup of speakers and into the audience, I'm quite overwhelmed, above all, by our two awardees. This is also the reason why I won't complain about the speaking time granted to me. We just heard George Marshall just needed 11 minutes to espouse his historic plan at Harvard University, and I've been allotted 10 minutes, so that's not bad. And also, I want to be in keeping with the spirit of George Marshall. He was not known for his long and fancy speaking, but for snappy and precise language, behooving his military background, and he knew very well life is more about quality than quantity. Ladies and gentlemen, the Marshall Plan is still firmly rooted in the collective memory of my country, Germany. It stands for a helping hand extended by the US to Germany, despite having been responsible for incomparable aggression and destruction in the Second World War. What a contrast to the situation after the First World War. Instead of demanding reparations, the US helped us to rebuild our economy. It's still an astonishing fact. And we are still tremendously grateful for this and will always be. With a short speech in Harvard, just 4 pages, I had a look at the original document the other day in the Department of State. So with this short speech, George Marshall launched a program that led to the economic recovery of a devastated continent. As we heard, $13 billion were funneled into Europe. It was meant to include Eastern European countries as the beneficiaries, but of course we know that they had to decline. More than 1/10 of the amount went to my home country, one of the central reasons for the so-called German economic miracle after the Second World War. It also reduced trade barriers, made Europeans drop unnecessary and discriminatory economic regulation, and took the first steps towards a European economic market. George Marshall's plan was not altruistic. It was just forward-looking policy. As he put it, it is only logical that the US should do whatever it's able to do to assist in the return of normal economic health in the world. But the plan's importance goes well beyond reconstruction and its economic aspects. Henry Kissinger put it himself in the following terms: the speech marked a historic departure in American foreign policy. The Marshall Plan set the course. The US could have gone home after the World War II, but it decided to stay and invested in Europe because it was in the interest of the United States to do so. This was the basis for closer European political cooperation, and it was the basis for strong and growing ties across the Atlantic. It created the foundation for the success of the Western world and ultimately set the course for the end of the Cold War, for our world of today. But ladies and gentlemen, this world seems to be crumbling. The post-Cold War order is under stress, some would say in disarray. This order, determined by well-established institutions and international law, is increasingly being called into question. A lot of people on both sides of the Atlantic are convinced that the nation state alone can save us in this unruly world, that nationalism and isolationism are the answer to all the problems. I am convinced it will lead us astray. So what would General Marshall recommend? First of all, we Europeans need to take more initiative again. This is what Chancellor Merkel meant when she said the other day, we, the Europeans, have to take the fate of Europe into our own hands. And this means, beyond anything else, that we should tackle a few things at home in Europe. The victory of Emmanuel Macron in France represents a huge opportunity for Europe, but it also means a great deal of responsibility for us. We must now ensure that we reform and strengthen Europe. And I mean all countries in the European Union, politically, economically, and yes, also militarily. Germany, as a nation at the heart of Europe, will be expected to take on more responsibility, always in cooperation with our partners. Europe has to do its homework. This is clear. But only together can the US and Europe strengthen our transatlantic ties. Together, we have to continue and expand our successful cooperation in NATO in the spirit of a trustful, long-term alliance, not just a short-term transactional relationship. And together, we have to continue to reform the international institutions that have shaped the world over the past decades. But this common effort goes beyond the sphere of politics and diplomacy. We also have to bring our societies closer together again, and we are facing a common problem. Our societies, whether in Europe or here in the United States, are becoming increasingly polarized, and this is not good for many reasons, and it's also dangerous for the transatlantic relationship. I believe we must do a better job in communicating why the right answer still lies in the ideas of George Marshall, in his goal of a close economic transatlantic partnership. And we have to explain why free and fair trade is a game in which, in the end, all parties win, not the opposite. Ladies and gentlemen, of course, we cannot restore a kind of Eurocentric transatlantic world. The economic balance is shifting towards Asia, towards China. But it would cost us dearly not to renew our transatlantic bond. Both the European and the US governments need to commit to a new common transatlantic agenda, a partnership that fights against oppression and terrorism, for the rule of law, for human rights, and for representative democracy. Those values are in need of defending today. And Europe and the US are the only powers able to defend it. But in the end, it's less about our ability, and I believe potentially more about our will, our dedication. It is to be hoped that the democratic nations can provide the necessary leadership. This is something General Marshall said during the beginning of the Cold War, several decades ago. And this need for leadership is as crucial today as it was back then. Ladies and gentlemen, two people who exemplify this very leadership are being honored here tonight, Secretary Kissinger and Mayor Bloomberg. I will not go into a full-blown laudatory speech. This is already being taken care of, and I'm mindful of my 10 minutes. But let me say one thing. Both of them have shown strong support for transatlantic cooperation, for multinational solutions. And they've worked to develop our existing institutions of cooperation. And this is the kind of leadership that is needed again today, here as well as on the other side of the Atlantic in Europe. Leadership in the spirit of General George Marshall. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for that insightful speech and also the intellectual leadership that you and your Chancellor are doing at this great time. Ladies and gentlemen, enjoy your dinner. We'll be back right after dinner for the awards. Thank you. Enjoy the dinner. It's a particular honor for me to be at a dinner in which two people I've studied and respected over the years are being honored. Mayor Michael Bloomberg, he's of course somebody who needs no introduction in a place like this, but if you go up on the deck and you look at the city of New York and you say, this is the greatest city in the world, and you marvel at the skyline, you have to realize that it's the greatest city in the world not just by chance, but because people made it that way. And Michael Bloomberg was one of the people who's made New York a really, really great city in this world. I've had the honor of serving on the board of Bloomberg Philanthropies, and the great pleasure of doing that is you get to see both the mind of Michael Bloomberg and the heart of Michael Bloomberg working in tandem. And as I said earlier this evening, the burst of creativity and innovation that occurred 70 years ago with the creation of all the institutions we're celebrating tonight, it would be nice if we could have a similar burst of creativity. Well, one such burst of creativity is the way that Mayor Bloomberg and Bloomberg Philanthropies have tried to tackle the issue of climate change. And even as some of our bigger institutions have trouble doing it, in the past week, Mayor Bloomberg has been able to have a climate change initiative where 1,000 mayors, governors, and CEOs in the United States said, we are still in, and they're still working with Bloomberg Philanthropies to make sure Dr. Henry Kissinger, even more so, is somebody who needs no introduction. But with his amazing self-deprecating humor, I once heard him say when somebody said that, there may be nobody who needs less of an introduction than me, but there's nobody who enjoys one more than me. So I will try to say a few words about my admiration for him. Henry Kissinger has been at the heart of U.S.-Atlantic relationships for the last 70 years. He left Germany for the first time in 1938 as a young teenager. He said, I'll be back, and he was. He came back as part of United States Army intelligence during the war. The second time he returned from Germany was 1947, because Harvard started admitting veterans who were returning, and he came back then just as General Marshall had given his speech. If you look at the pantheon of 20th century statesmen who deserve to be up there with General George C. Marshall, the list is pretty short. Of course, you have Colonel Henry Stimson, you probably have Dean Acheson, and the only other person you'd put in that pantheon is Dr. Henry Kissinger. Not only has he been one of the great statecrafters of American foreign policy, he's also been one of the great intellectuals of American foreign policy, up there with George Kennan, who laid the groundwork for the policy that included the Marshall Plan. There's a lot of things he brought in his thinking to foreign policy. There's wonderful ideas of the strategy that he was able to see, the triangular diplomacy. But I just want to say about one particular trait that he brought to diplomacy and continues to bring to his thinking. It's a word he uses often, but you don't hear often anywhere else. He used it often in his book. And the word was nuance. And the notion is that things aren't always black or white, that whether we're dealing with the Russians or dealing with the Chinese or anybody else, we have to figure out what their national interests are, what our national interests are, and figure out a way to have a balanced, nuanced, and sophisticated policy where we can both cooperate and compete as necessary. That type of nuance is sometimes lacking in our foreign policy, but is not lacking in the thinking that Dr. Kissinger has given us in his book on diplomacy, his book on China. I hope someday he'll write a book on Russia, where we also need to know how to operate that nuance. In order to introduce our first awardee, which is Michael Bloomberg, I'm privileged to introduce a person who's had a successful string of adventures that's taken him around the world. Vartan Gregorian is the 12th president of the Carnegie Corporation of New York, one of the many institutions founded by Andrew Carnegie. He was born in Tabriz, Iran, of Armenian parents, received his elementary education in Iran, his secondary education in Lebanon, and then his college and PhD education at Stanford University. A nice mix, if I could say so. He taught European and Middle Eastern history at San Francisco State, at the UCLA, at the University of Texas. 1972, he joined the University of Pennsylvania, both as a dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, the founding dean, and then the 23rd provost in 1981. He also served as the president of the New York Public Library, and then was appointed the head of Brown University. On a personal note, I'll say two things about Dr. Gregorian. One is that I tend to admire people by their ability to understand how they turn history into policy. His writings, especially his book on Islam, Mosaic, Not a Monolith, is something everybody should read. And as a native New Orleanian who was involved after Hurricane Katrina, I also always think of people who came and helped us after the storm. And before the waters had even receded, Vartan Gregorian was there. I remember a dinner on St. Charles Avenue in the only restaurant we could find that had food. And he said, "Don't worry, we'll bring it back. We'll bring the libraries back." And he did. So it's a personal pleasure as well as an honor for me to present Dr. Vartan Gregorian.
Good evening. As usual, Walter gave my speech, so I'll try to repeat portions of it. George Marshall was a visionary, warrior, diplomat, and chief architect of reconstruction of post-World War II Europe. He was not a builder of walls, but of bridges, forming long-term ties between Europe and the United States. It's therefore most appropriate that tonight we honor two bridge builders, a consummate diplomat, Dr. Henry Kissinger, and the man it is my honor and pleasure to introduce tonight, Mayor Michael Bloomberg. As a public servant, philanthropist, and businessman, Mike has embraced his roles with dedication, exuberance, and humility, because he believes that with wealth and power come responsibilities. Mike is a man of conviction and a man of principle. He possesses both intellectual honesty and personal integrity. His altruism resonates not only in New York, but throughout much of the country and abroad. We all know that it's not easy fit to be mayor of New York City. After all, it's one of the most complex, diverse, dynamic, fast-moving, and assertive metropolises in the world, facing enormous challenges. Immediately after 9/11, as it was mentioned by Walter already, Mike led the city out of one of its darkest periods. For example, he helped successfully form the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, as well as 9/11 Memorial and the Museum. During Mike's tenure as the 108th mayor of the New York City, economy and culture flourished. Crime went down to record lows. High school graduate rates soared, and New York became greener and greater than ever before. Of course, Mike has not just been mayor, but also a true philanthropist, a man of innumerable good works, some publicly known and some unknown. His philanthropic support in the areas of public health, the environment, education, arts and culture, and social services is extraordinary. I know this firsthand because I was privileged to oversee the disbursement of nearly $200 million of his what came to be known as the anonymous mayor's grants prior to Mike's founding of Bloomberg Philanthropies. His generosity encompasses myriad causes, including groundbreaking programs to reduce tobacco use, cope with climate change, and remove illegal guns from the streets of our cities. In these fields and more, Mike's philanthropy has had great and lasting impact, touching the lives of millions. His continued philanthropic investments will, I'm sure, go on to impact the lives of millions more. It's no wonder that even after this mayor, the time as mayor, Mike has used the power of his words and his philanthropy to confront major international challenges, including in the realms of public health and environment, as it was mentioned. He knows that America is not apart from humanity, but is part of it. In a recent interview with 60 Minutes, Mike quipped, "When I get to heaven," he said, "I'm not sure I'm going to stand for an interview. I'm going to go right in." Well, I will leave to Mike to negotiate the afterlife. But as a historian, I can assure you that he has most certainly earned himself earthly immortality. After all, he has invested in and promoted so many vital institutions, universities, libraries, museums, and other cultural organizations which constitute what I call the DNA of our civilization. For all the above contributions and more, Mike deserves to be honored and remembered. In short, this evening we are celebrating a great human being, a great New Yorker, and a great American whom my wife and I are proud and privileged to call our friend. We respect, admire, and love him. By the way, none of these compliments are tax exempt. You should know that. In all seriousness, I am honored to introduce my friend Mike Bloomberg tonight to receive the inaugural George Marshall Foundation Humanitarian Award. Thank you, Mike.
Good job. Great. Thank you for those eloquent remarks, Dr. Gregorian. And now it's my pleasure to invite Jay Adams, the chairman of the Marshall Foundation Board of Trustees, and Mayor Michael Bloomberg to the stage.
Michael Bloomberg, you are being honored today for your extraordinary philanthropy and the effects of your generosity on the lives of countless individuals and numerous organizations that have benefited from your largesse. Your first job on Wall Street was with Salomon Brothers, where you climbed the ladder quickly, becoming a partner in 1972. In 1981, you started Bloomberg LP to change the way securities data were stored and consumed. The company has been enormously successful, growing to more than 19,000 employees in 192 locations worldwide. You have leveraged your success in business to create a philanthropic organization of significance. Today, Bloomberg Philanthropies employs a unique data-driven approach to global change. That approach grew out of your experiences as an entrepreneur and three-term mayor of New York. Bloomberg Philanthropies has donated more than $4 billion to various causes and organizations in support of your desire to improve public health, arts and culture, the environment, education, and government. Like General George C. Marshall, you have excelled as a strategic thinker, a problem solver, and a visionary whose world you attempt to make better. We are honored to present you with the inaugural George C. Marshall Foundation Humanitarian Award on this date, June 7, 2017, in New York City.
Well, thank you, Jay. And just let me say for the record, if I had told my teachers back in Medford, Massachusetts, many, many years ago that one day I would be receiving an award named for the architect of Allied victory in World War II, or on the same night that we honor one of America's greatest statesmen, Henry Kissinger, none of my teachers would have believed it. Let me start by thanking the Marshall Foundation for this great honor. And I want to thank my friends Vartan Gregorian and Walter Isaacson for those very kind words. They were overdone, but they could have gone on a little longer. I didn't know. Both of them seriously have found many ways to make a difference, and they've both been important partners for Bloomberg Philanthropies, and they really have been a role model for me in life. I also want to join everyone here in applauding my close friend, Henry Kissinger. I don't think there's anyone more deserving of the Marshall Foundation Award. It would actually be very hard to find two people who did more to shape the world we know than Henry and George Marshall. And of course, Henry continues to be one of the most influential and insightful thinkers on global affairs. I have recommended his books to so many people, I think I should start getting a cut of the royalties. When General Marshall was leading the Allied operations in World War II, I was just in diapers, so I certainly didn't know about him then. But while I was too young to remember those years, I grew up in the post-war era that the Marshall Plan, more than any other single act of statecraft, did so much to define. Marshall understood the lesson from the First World War, that winning on the battlefield is not enough, and that sustaining world peace requires strong American leadership. He understood, I would argue, that putting America first meant supporting our allies, cooperating with them, and investing in their growth. And after World War II, thank you. And after World War II, the Marshall Plan lifted Europe back onto its feet, and as it did, it lifted America as well. The stability and prosperity it sowed helped to build a secure future for America and for Europe. But the success of the Marshall Plan cannot be measured in GDP alone. Most importantly of all, the Marshall Plan solidified the preeminence of American leadership on the global stage, which is a legacy that we still enjoy today and that we must never squander. The challenges now facing the world, from terrorism to climate change, are more complex than ever before, and that makes American leadership more important than ever. If Washington retreats from those global challenges, we will pay a terrible price. If, however, we draw inspiration from Marshall and from the president he served so well as both Secretary of State and Defense, one of my heroes, Harry Truman, then we can continue to make America stronger and greater than ever, and continue to build a more peaceful and prosperous world. I've been lucky enough to have a chance to contribute to that work through public service and philanthropy, and I can just tell you that there's nothing more rewarding. George Marshall left us an example of how, by helping others, we reward ourselves and our country. Diplomacy, he knew, is not creating winners and losers. It is creating cooperation and coordination and sharing mutual respect so that we can all live in peace. It is an example that we must never forget, and I couldn't be more honored to help celebrate his life and legacy. So once again, Jay, thank you for you and all the directors for the great award. If my mother and father were here, they'd be proud. Thank you. God bless.
Congratulations. When we talk about the generation of wise men or wise men and women who 70 years ago created these institutions, I, with a friend of mine, wrote a book with that title, and I get asked every now and then, who are the wise men or wise women of today? One name always springs to mind, which is Ambassador Thomas Pickering. Thomas Pickering, who is going to introduce Dr. Kissinger, is a career diplomat, and during his long and successful career, he served as U.S. Ambassador to the Russian Federation, India, Israel, El Salvador, Nigeria, and Jordan. As a very young reporter, I had the pleasure of covering the wars in El Salvador and getting hospitality from Ambassador Pickering at his residence, which was much nicer than the coverage we had to do. He was Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs from 1997 to 2000, the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, where he led the effort to build the coalition in the Security Council before and during and after the Gulf War. He held additional positions in Tanzania, Geneva, and Washington, including serving as Special Assistant to Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. After retiring from the department in 2000, he joined Boeing as a Senior Vice President and a member of its Executive Council. He serves on a number of nonprofit boards, including the Board of Trustees of the George C. Marshall Foundation. He holds degrees from Bowdoin, the Fletcher School of Diplomacy, University of Melbourne, and he speaks French, Spanish, Swahili fluently, Arabic, Hebrew, and Russian. Please welcome one of the true wise men, Ambassador Thomas Pickering.
Thank you,
sir.
Walter. You really exceeded yourself. Thank you, Walter, very much, and a good evening to all of you. I come today as a refugee from the new seat of the axis of adults on whom we are depending to save the world, to this city of tranquility, predictability, and good sense. And you don't know what a breath of fresh air it is. It's a special honor and pleasure tonight to join in paying tribute to former Secretary of State, Dr. Henry A. Kissinger. As Walter mentioned a moment ago, most speakers usually start this sort of talk on someone already so well known by saying the honoree really doesn't need the introduction or tribute. And that, of course, is especially true here, as we've heard all evening. Dr. Kissinger is a world star, and we are all delighted to be here to honor him this evening. I remember Dr. Kissinger, for whom I worked briefly, most saliently for the fact that in any meeting I ever attended with him, he was the most insightful, thoughtful, and strategic voice in the room. So much so that both I and I think everyone else always said to ourselves that what he said was so clear and so self-evident to us as he explained it, so obvious, that we thought, why didn't we think of that ourselves? Along with the two presidents he served, he made a seminal and groundbreaking contribution to American foreign and security policy in the Middle East in dealing with the Ramadan Yom Kippur War, with China in its opening, with Europe in its consolidation, and with the Soviet Union in finding answers to the nuclear problems he studied so deeply of building stability and security in a world tense and indeed confrontational to the point where nuclear use was not out of the question. He added not only insight but solutions, stability, and security to the world fraught with tension, competition, and danger. And then when the time came at the end of the Cold War, he provided careful thought, introspection, and wise advice on shaping the future, sadly not all of which has been taken. The U.S. opening to China was one of his most remarkable achievements, and China became both a fascination for him and, Henry, I dare say, love, and I expect as well sometimes something of a trial. His book on China is the equal and more of his many writings. It is always worth a reread as we contemplate, with his help and advice through that book, in these halcyon days, a relationship that well might be the most important in our nation's and the world's future. Dr. Kissinger writes with the same fluency and insight as he speaks. It is a special pleasure always to read and absorb his wise and careful choice of words. This is particularly true for diplomats, where words have real meaning, especially Henry Kissinger's words. And I cannot help but with some hesitancy to observe, and I guess I must ask at the beginning of this for his forgiveness in advance, that in a long and quiet and rarely observed contest with his sibling, he has managed to continue to preserve faultlessly in English the unmistakable accent of his first language. Before I close, just a few personal reminiscences. Dr. Kissinger, when he gave his first speech as Secretary of State to the United States to the General Assembly in New York of the UN in the autumn of 1973, assembled a number of truly great people to work for him, led by Winston Lord. Winston kept the drafts coming to Henry, and he and others improved and honed the documents as it went on.
After about draft number 18, when Dr. Kissinger had not yet given Winston any real feedback, he brought Winston into his office and asked him if this was really the best he could do. If so, he said he would now read it. I had the pleasure then of joining a small group working on the draft with Dr. Kissinger and the final text. It was a speech memorable for its careful analysis of world issues and wise recommendations. It was really Henry's maiden speech to the international community, but it was also one truly forged with ringing blows on the anvil of give and take with the closest leadership of the master smith in charge. As a new American ambassador to the UN in New York in 1989, I was not really sure what kind of contacts I could establish with Dr. Kissinger here in town. I was only sure that if I could, they would be very helpful. And he took that out of my hands by very early reaching out to me, asking me to dinner in his apartment in my honor with many of New York's luminaries and movers and shakers. He called on me after a very generous introduction to speak about my work at the UN. I emerged from the dinner as a result of his initiative and his help with a most gracious and well-established entree into the city and its leadership, and this impressed as well my diplomatic colleagues here at the UN, and I will be forever grateful to him for opening those doors to me at a time when it was most useful. And so tonight I join with all of you here in thanking Dr. Kissinger for his many and vast contributions to this nation, for its stability, for its survival, and his wisdom. And at the other end of the spectrum, in a very humble way, for his unfailing support and kindness to me over many years. And I know that all of you will join with me now in congratulating him with warm applause for the award we will bestow on him, and in wishing him well now and in the years to come. And thank you very much.
Let me invite Mr. Adams back up to present the citation and the award to Henry Kissinger.
Henry Kissinger, you are being honored today for a lifetime dedicated to supporting free enterprise and democracy throughout the globe, and for your skilled statesmanship in solving tough problems. As U.S. Secretary of State, you conducted high-level diplomatic talks and reached agreement leading to peace with Vietnam. You received the Nobel Prize in 1973 for brokering the accords that ended that conflict. In addition to ending U.S. involvement in Vietnam, you helped achieve other significant U.S. foreign policy goals. You opened the door to a highly celebrated and visible relationship with the People's Republic of China. You were instrumental in bringing about a détente with the Soviet Union and negotiating strategic arms limitation treaty. Your role in containing the Yom Kippur War between Israel and Egypt in 1973 was crucial in ending that war. Also, you have been National Security Advisor to one president and a Foreign Intelligence Advisor to another, serving in total 5 U.S. presidents in various official capacities. Your record as statesman, advisor, and counselor is without modern comparison. Like your predecessor, General George C. Marshall, you have shared U.S. Army service during World War II, the Nobel Peace Prize, and significant senior-level federal government positions. Also, like General Marshall, the results of your many accomplishments endure today. we are honored to present you with the George C. Marshall Foundation Award on this date, June 7, 2017, in New York City.
After hearing these eloquent introductions, I'm reminded of an occasion in which I introduced Lord Carrington to a speech in England in what I thought was extreme eloquence. And he got up and said, "After hearing this, I can hardly wait to hear what I'm going to say." But I have no trouble knowing what to say. First of all, about my colleague being honored here, Mike Bloomberg. The task of a leader is to take his society from where it is to where it has never been. And for that, he's always on a tightrope. If he moves too fast, he falls off. If he moves too slowly, his society stagnates. Mike has made a tremendous contribution to our society by being on a tightrope for decades with a vision and a courage that has served us all. And I have had the good fortune of a friendship that is deep and moving. I would like to say a word also about Tom Pickering. The relationship of the Secretary to the Foreign Service always has a certain ambivalence, partly because the Secretary knows that not every Foreign Service officer is convinced that the Secretary could have passed the Foreign Service exam. But also, every Secretary learns that in order to get his job done, he needs the experience, the dedication, the commitment of the Foreign Service. It is a group of men and women who have dedicated their lives to serving this country in distant outposts. Tom has been one of the premier leaders of the Foreign Service. And it's in his blood, so that out of office, he has participated in many so-called track 2 negotiations that greatly advanced the cause of peace and the fundamental interests of the United States. So there are so many other people here, like Madame Gregorian, that have meant much my life and to our society. And Walter Isaacson, who has been a friend and colleague, and with whom I have had debates and many common views. So thank you all for what you have said and for what you have contributed. For me, the Marshall Foundation Award means a great deal. I started my public service in 1943 as a draftee in the Second World War, of which General Marshall was described as the engineer of victory. I returned from the war and in the fall of 1947 entered Harvard as a beneficiary of the GI Bill of Rights. George Marshall had come to the campus 3 months earlier, 5 months after hanging up his uniform to become Secretary of State. He celebrated the first normal commencement the university had conducted since the outbreak of the war. His speech proved to be seminal for the structure of the post-war world order. George Marshall was a leader, not a star. His guiding principle was service, not the fulfillment of personal ambition. To him, service was its own reward. There is the story of his reaction to being informed by a duty colonel that our troops had landed on Omaha Beach at 3 in the morning. "And what do you expect me to do about it?" he said. He put forward the Marshall Plan in the same understated manner. Witnesses later recalled that the general rarely looked up from the crumpled pages he had carried to the podium in his jacket pocket. Duty to Marshall could only be impaired by embellishment. Before VE Day, Roosevelt had told Churchill that America could not remain involved in Europe for more than a few months after the end of the war. Now, in June 1947, Marshall called on the United States to implement ideas and values we shared with Western Europe, and calling on America by doing whatever it was able to pursue their common future. The Marshall Plan challenged the nostalgia for isolationism by making this long-term commitment. When Marshall declared war on hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos in Europe, America took responsibility for Atlantic stability, a responsibility that has not ended to this day. It was a clarion call. America would participate permanently in the construction and maintenance of world order, and its quest would be enduring, imbued with the values in whose defense the United States had entered the war. From June 1947 to its termination at the end of 1951, the Marshall Plan contributed roughly $100 billion in today's money to the recovery of Europe. It laid successfully the foundation for the contemporary period. It began as an economic undertaking, but it gained momentum by the vision and leadership of both Americans and Europeans on both sides of the Atlantic. Truman, Acheson, de Gasperi, Schuman, Adenauer are just a few of those names. It evolved into an economic union. And from there to the European Coal and Steel Community, which became the European Union, and eventually a security union in the form of NATO. And these commitments are permanent expressions of values. They have to be adjusted in their execution from time to time, but they cannot be altered because they represent fundamental interests. But with all of these achievements, success is an admission ticket to a new set of problems. The history of national sovereignty in Europe has been modified, but some of its legacies have prevented the emergence of a full political complement to its economic unity, leaving Europe to some extent suspended between its history and its future. But to fill this gap and to relate it to the values and needs on this side of the Atlantic was a vision at the time of General Marshall. It is a necessity today. The world has globalized. Every region, for the first time in history, is interacting with the others. New nations have arisen to affect the global balance of powers. So the contemporary challenge can no longer be met by individual technical economic programs, however important. What is required is programs reflecting an evolution towards a new concept of world order. And here, the efforts that were initiated by General Marshall remain vibrant imperatives because of what the great British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher called our common heritage and experience of liberty. The Marshall Plan succeeded in both America and Europe. They developed a vision of a joint future and put their faith in it. A lesson for our period is that, of course, we are aware of obstacles. And by definition, the work is never completed and therefore always lacking in some aspects. But the work of defining world order, including within it the transatlantic relationship, is far from done. In fact, the challenge on whether that effort, which is imposed on us by necessity, will continue to be done by a united Atlantic community adapted to new conditions. It is a continuous process. It demands of us the same conviction and creativity as our predecessors displayed, among whom George Marshall stands as a giant, whose name It is an honor to receive this award. Thank you all for coming and for this honor.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, this has been quite an evening, I'm sure you'll agree. To each of you again, I say thank you for being part of our recognition of two extraordinary individuals, for remembering George C. Marshall and the Marshall Plan, and for joining us on our journey to return General Marshall to the forefront of public consciousness in this country and beyond. Thanks also to our dinner committee that did so much to make this such a successful event. To Clifford Miller-Yonts, co-chair, Kurt Polk, co-chair, Jay Adams, Matt Cole, Greg Robertson, and Donnie Wilkinson. Thank you to our program participants who added so much to this wonderful evening. Walter Isaacson, Vartan Gregorian, Tom Pickering, and Ambassador Peter Wittig. We are also deeply appreciative, too, of those countries that, in the spirit of the Marshall Plan, helped gather support for this evening's event. They include Italy, Iceland, France, Korea, and perhaps most substantially, the Kingdom of the Netherlands. In November 1947, in a statement to a joint meeting of the Senate Foreign Relations and House Foreign Affairs Committees, Secretary Marshall commented that it is in the American tradition to help. In helping others, we will be helping ourselves because, in the larger sense, our national interests coincide with those of a free and prosperous Europe. 70 years later, that has not been forgotten. Congratulations again to Secretary Kissinger, to Mayor Michael Bloomberg. It has been our honor entirely. As you return to your homes, your offices, please continue to remember George C. Marshall, what he did, how he did it, and remember also the Marshall Foundation's efforts to keep alive that legacy now and into the future. That, ladies and gentlemen, concludes the Marshall Foundation Awards evening. On your way out, I hope you will take a moment to enjoy the medley of service songs performed by the VMI Brass Quintet. Safe travels and good night.